Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the lecture for Module 3. Just a bit of a recap in terms of where we've been and maybe perhaps a little bit of a direction as to where we're going. But we first started off the course by talking about developing one's leadership identity. And so you all have just completed the paper on your leadership identity, how it's sort of developed to where it is now. And it's with kind of that in mind that we're focusing in on the specific skills that we need for leadership in negotiation as it relates to relational skills. So we started focusing in on empathy, but again, this isn't simply a matter of developing empathy. Certainly you need to have that skill, but then, and what we've been doing in the last week, certainly last module, and starting even a little bit the module prior, is taking this skill and trying to determine, and figure out how you can use that skill both within the context of leadership and in the context of negotiation. And by that, using it in order to get the outcome that you desire, using it to get the outcome that is better than your best alternative to not having a negotiated agreement, but also within the leadership concept that it is not simply an outcome that is derived because it benefits you solely. So again, we're looking at how to use empathy and perspective taking to get that outcome. Secondly, I think the other thing we need to examine a little bit, it was raised by the materials in Module 3, and that is, and usually when I refer to it and when I have written my responses to your posts, generally what I do is I say empathy and or perspective taking. And so the question is whether or not we need to break those two things down. Does it matter? Is one better than the other? And so when we look at some of the two articles that we examined last week, primarily the one article, Why It Pays to Get Inside the Head of Your Opponent, first of all, they make a point that those are two different skills, and from their conclusion, they draw the conclusion that, in fact, it does matter and one skill is better than the other. So first of all, and again, I think that this is not only a concept for are you using empathy, perspective taking, and assertiveness, but it really is, it goes into the whole concept of negotiating as a leader. So focusing only on self-interests tends to lead to excessive aggression, obstinacy, whereas focusing only on others' interests encourages excessive concession making to the detriment of one's own outcomes. And some of you in your papers and in your posts have kind of referenced that is a difficult balance for you, and that sometimes by being empathetic, it leads you to be or to concede perhaps normal or beyond what you'd like to, and thus you're kind of giving up on the concept of getting the outcome that you want. So it's true that you need to balance, it's a balance of attention both for self and other interests, and that's critical for facilitating creative problem solving in negotiations. And it's also critical, again, for that whole concept of one being a leader and then trying to get an outcome that has balanced what you want against the interests of the other side, so that you've considered both perspectives when developing your your desired outcome and what your best alternative to a negotiated agreement would be. So when we look at why it pays to get into the head of your opponent, first of all, they say that given that the understanding one's opponent is valuable for success in competitive interactions, it seems likely that the individual characteristics associated with such understanding would prove advantageous. And so that, again, is raising the concept of the two skills, perspective taking and empathy, and those have been shown to motivate social understanding. But the question is one better than the other in both leadership and negotiation? So when they did their studies, what's important to sort of understand is that they started from the get-go saying, we predicted that perspective taking would be a more valuable strategy than empathy in strategic interactions. First, we believe perspective taking helps negotiators find the necessary balance between competition and cooperation, between self-interest and other interest. And so really what that was their sort of perspective or belief as to what their study would show. And they go on to say that there is, as I've quoted in the slide, there is suggestive evidence that perspective taking and empathy may not have the same effects in strategic interactions. And when they examine perspective taking, they basically say those who are able or those who are good at it, that ability is associated with personality characteristics such as high self-esteem and low neuroticism, whereas empathy would predict a person's emotionality. Now, one thing to consider is that this is an article written in 2008, as you see from sort of the literature that they went back and cited in their article. In this case, it was 2 articles written by Davis, but those are in 1980 and 1983. And, posit for a moment or question for a moment whether or not, even since the 2008, whether or not leadership and negotiation is moving in the direction away from the Galinsky paper, and that empathy is becoming is becoming more valued than it was 10 years ago. And but anyway, staying in conjunction, and then we can sort of circle back and talk about, how do you as a leader and how do you as a negotiator want to use and incorporate empathy if you do, taking into consideration this study. That's an individual choice, and it also may depend upon whether or not, if you're able to employ empathy, can you turn it off such that you're not doing a disservice to your own desired outcome. But anyway, moving sort of forward here, in this particular study, as you recall, it was a group of folks that they got together to study interactions regarding the purchase and sale of a gas station. And perspective-taking tendencies, as they started to see, increased negotiators' ability to arrive at a creative solution that met both parties' needs. Empathy, in contrast, did not prove effective in the negotiations. The advantages of perspective taking were independent of the big 5 personality variables, and you can go back and reread the article if you need more explanation. Evidence that perspective taking contributes unique explanatory variance in negotiations. And so when they did study number 1, certainly the outcome proved their prediction regarding that, perspective taking was in fact more beneficial, and empathy was less valuable in a strategic negotiation. And for our purposes, I think, except when you're solely talking about empathy and you're not necessarily so focused in on, whether you're going to be getting the outcome you desire, we're really looking at collaboration, then certainly empathy may play a greater role. But in the negotiations, and I want you, to perhaps think about both contexts or even other contexts when you're reading forum questions, when you're posting, when you're writing things, just when you're in reading or going through the materials, don't just simply put all of these concepts in, one place or one type of negotiation, or, this is a collaborative negotiation and the outcome, what I want really isn't all that important. Collaboration, getting buy-in is what, is most important. But, and so you may think one way, and certainly perhaps empathy and perspective taking may have different contributions in that setting, but then also always put it into a more competitive situation where you're having to try to get somebody to influence that person who's resistant to your outcome. And, then is perspective taking more important? What role would empathy play, and does it play any role? And again, when you look at Galinsky and his co-authors, they're basically coming, at least after study one, saying that, empathy really didn't contribute to, a solution that led to a good strategic outcome in the negotiation. And the way that they went about this, and certainly when they started to look at the negotiation in study number 2, is that they looked and said, in preparing for the negotiation and during the negotiation, for empathy folks, they were told, take the perspective of the service station owner, try to understand what they are feeling, what emotions they may be experiencing in selling the station. Try to imagine what you would feel in that role. And so that's how they got the empathy, the group that was trying to negotiate with empathy, the mindset was created in that way. In the folks who were being studied as it related to perspective taking, the buyers were told, in preparing for the negotiation and during the negotiation, take the perspective of the service station owner, try to understand what they are thinking, what their interests and purposes are in selling the station, try to imagine what you would be thinking in that role. And that's how the different groups were studied, and that's the mindset that they each had going into the negotiation. And again, what the findings or the conclusion of the authors was that although empathy had immediate effective benefits for the other side, empathizers did not have an advantage over control participants in producing deals that would provide long-term value for themselves and their opponents. In contrast, perspective takers secured the most agreements and did so with sufficient satisfaction on the part of their opponents. So again, I think when you look at their conclusion, they basically was empathy was generally less useful than perspective taking, and was at times a detriment to both discovering creative solutions and self-interest. And two, they did conclude, however, that although it is possible that the positive interpersonal capital empathizers built up in the initial negotiation could facilitate future agreements between negotiators such that the outcome of benefits of empathy may emerge over time. So, in other words, if this is a one and done deal, they really don't see much benefit to using empathy. But if this is a negotiation and you are going to be negotiating with that partner or that person in the future, then empathy may help build that relationship in order to facilitate better outcomes in the future, given the relationship that's developed through empathy. So that again is really the way that that the authors looked at perspective taking and looked at empathy. And so the question is, what do we do with this? And again, one thing to be mindful is that, as you're developing the skill of empathy, the question is, and let's actually go back and I'll try to, the question is, can you employ empathy without it becoming something that sort of takes over the negotiations and is not necessarily going to allow you, well, we'll just jump back to the conclusions. It's not necessarily going to allow you to get the deal that you want. So if that's the case, if that skill has not been developed to a satisfactory level for you, and you know that it's harming you and getting the outcomes, then you want to focus more on perspective taking and less on empathy. Because again, you're not negotiating to get a deal. You're negotiating to get the deal that's right for you and the deal that is the outcome that you're looking for. So, you really have to determine and have some good mindfulness about whether or not empathy for you is really sympathy, and then you find yourself giving up and giving concessions more than you would like, and potentially negotiating against your own interest. If you're capable of giving both empathy and perspective taking, then the question is, well, should I even bother, in light of Galinsky, to employ empathy? Or if I'm not good at empathy, should I worry about developing that skill to employ in negotiations? And I would suggest to you that the answer to that question is yes. So my experience, and again, it may depend upon the nature of the negotiations that you're involved with, but my experience is that really best negotiators have the ability to use empathy, can use it in a way that doesn't lead to sort of bidding against yourself or giving concessions against your own interest, unless, of course, that is providing you a perspective that really says that you need to change your BATNA. But if you're not changing your BATNA and you have the goal that you have, can you use empathy is part of perspective taking in order to first get an agreement, and then also, make sure that that agreement is the one that you want. So I think that good negotiators use both. And so, what's my support for that? One is experience, but let's examine some of the things that we've kind of looked at and at least give you why I think it to be true. So, first of all, this is Joshua Prager from the video that we watched last week. And so there's a lot going on in that video, and some of it is perhaps philosophy of life, but some of it relates to negotiation and trying to develop or trying to influence another person to get what you want. So, in the course of his talk, Mr. Prager stated that the purpose of that meeting is that he came looking for remorse. So he wanted Abed to be remorseful, to say, I'm sorry. So that was his real goal in the negotiation. But, what he took away from that, which I think is really something to be mindful of, and where I think empathy plays an important role is that problems, as he states, that problems of the heart hit with a force greater than a runaway truck. Right? So relationships that that get broken, hit with a very serious force, and sometimes it's that force of the broken heart, if you will, that creates the real problems, and that problems of the mind are even greater still, right? So the injury to the person and the thought process and the why me sort of thought process, or whatever's going on in the mind, are even greater. And those two things, the problems of the heart and the problems of the mind, are more injurious, Joshua Prager says, than 100 broken necks. So it's not the physical injury, it's the problem with the heart and the problem with the mind that he experienced, and it was much easier, using the word easy or easier in a very loose way. It was much easier for him to deal with his physical injury than it was with the problem of the mind. And so when we think about that, depending upon the type of negotiation that we're dealing with, right? So the type of negotiations that I'm dealing with, oftentimes we're dealing with problems of the heart, we're dealing with problems of the mind, in addition to an injury, and that can be true whether it's a medical negligence case, an automobile accident case, not so much automobile accident case, but to a certain extent some, employment cases where people have been long-term employees and they get laid off, and what happened is, it may be easier for them to deal with the financial complications of being laid off or being terminated for whatever reason, but it's the problem of, I was a long-term employee, I gave that business or gave that company, everything I had for many years. I worked, long hours, and never took a vacation or took very few vacations, and now they treat me this way. So it's not always the financial, I can't afford to live without an income, or I can only get a job with that I'm going to make less money. That's, of course, a problem. But oftentimes, it's the, how dare they treat me this way after being such a valuable and dedicated employee for all these years. In the medical malpractice case, it's, people go into a doctor-patient relationship or a healthcare provider-patient relationship, and that has a very, there's a very significant relationship there. And it's a relationship of trust. And so if something goes wrong, some people, some patients, if they perceive it's the doctor, the nurses, the healthcare provider's fault, or they weren't attentive in their minds, they're going to believe that there was a breach of trust. So it's not just the harm that occurs, it's not just the injury, it's not just the loss of a family member. It's that broken trust that you have to consciously be aware of when you're trying to negotiate with the other side, whether it's that kind of case or an issue within an employment setting, an issue within a family. You can see the emotional connection or the problem within the mind differently than the actual real injury itself or the problem that that was created. And so empathy, in my mind, is an effort to sort of reestablish trust. And when we think of the video that that we watched last week, it's not about the nail, obviously a very humorous video, and really developed for to exemplify how men and women communicate differently. But I also think there's lessons sort of to be learned within a negotiation as it relates to perspective taking and empathy. But what we see, and this is why I think, particularly within many negotiations, including a purchase and sale of a business. If that business owner who's trying to sell it, has a very strong connection of, I built this business, this was my business, I developed it, I've got the goodwill in it. There might be a very emotional component to the sale beyond just what's the true value and purchase price of the business, right? So, empathy can create, first of all, the trust. And I think, I'm going to go back to the video for just a minute to sort of show you, what I see and why that, and where I think that moment is, right? So here we go.
This is fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is.
Right there, right? You now have that moment of trust that is created. And, obviously we go on and see sort of the end of it, but, actually let's watch it.
Ow!
Come on, if you would just
Don't.
So, you have trust, and then the trust gets broken because he loses it, right? And so it's at that moment that you create trust that what's the next thing you should do? And here is a concept we'll talk a little bit about later, but what good negotiators have to learn is then timing, right? We're using the various ingredients, we're learning the various ingredients, and the question is timing. And so at this point in time, you've gained trust. He's gained her trust before the, effort to embrace and then getting stuck with the nail. But at that moment that he got the trust, the next thing still to be done is then to work with perspective taking to make sure, one, that you have all of the information, right? Oftentimes, what healthcare providers are taught, but it's an expression that's used in many different contexts, and that is, if you hear hoofbeats, you don't think zebras, right? So for a doctor, for instance, or a nurse, or somebody in the medical field, if you're starting to try to determine or assess what's really going on, what's wrong, you look for those things based on the constellation of from your examination and history. You look for those things that are most likely going on, but a little bit different in negotiations and leadership is you want to explore a lot to make sure that in this one case, you're not missing something. In this one case, it's not a zebra, to the extent that you can, right? So, we all look at that video and listen to her story, and you think, well, it is about the nail. But certainly asking questions, developing, what the true experience is, make sure that, hey, there's not something else going on here. But as you probe the questions, as you get the responses, one is it will become clear that it is the nail. And two is by these questions, you're now trying to get perspective, but you're also trying to shift the perspective of the person that you're dealing with so that they sort of see what makes more sense, and you have the ability to influence them. So again, from my perspective, empathy can play a role when there's emotional component to the case or to the situation in order to try to first gain trust. And then perspective taking helps create influence. And I think that that's how I look at it. But again, you have to have both the capacity to give and to be empathetic without it impacting your ability to maintain your own desired outcome. And then you also have to have the ability to be good at perspective taking in order to try to influence. So that's where there's the questions, that's where there's the reframing, that's where you're trying to influence the mind of the person that you're negotiating with, and then being assertive, coming back and being assertive. So I will tell you about a negotiation that I was in recently. It may sound like one I've already talked about, but again, it was in the context of a medical negligence case, and we had chosen to try to resolve the case before it went into a lawsuit. And so, there's a few Cialdini concepts, although we're not necessarily, well, I guess we are, but not in a manipulative way. I mean, certainly not making a former patient, or in this case, a survivor, a surviving spouse, go through years of litigation and, have to sort of deal with denial from the side of her husband's physician. We decided that what we would do is we would enter into negotiations early on in hopes that, one, it would engender goodwill in that regard, but it's also because, it just made sense. This was a case we felt could be defended, but we also knew that there were issues. From my perspective, both on behalf of my client, but also for the surviving spouse and the two surviving teenage children, if this is a case that we would look to try to negotiate 2 years from now or 2.5 years from now, why not try to negotiate it now and see if we can get the resolution that we would be looking for, even though we're giving up some information and giving up the opportunity to gain information that would potentially help us lessen the settlement value. There's also reasons not to do that, especially if we think that, one, we know what our BATNA is, and that BATNA probably isn't going to change much over the course of 2 years, especially since we recognize or believe that the case, that the physician, probably gave good care. So we wouldn't be settling this at full value, if you will, but we would be doing it at some kind of a negotiated value, because there's risks to us of losing the case, but there was also risks that the family could go through the entire litigation, go to trial, and lose the case and get nothing. So there was significant risks on both sides. Now, when we go into the negotiation, and in this case, we often will use a mediator. When we go into the negotiation, I know that there's emotional connection here. So I don't think that I'm going to necessarily, influence her or get a negotiated agreement simply by using empathy. But I do want to do a couple of things and at least gain some trust. It won't be perfect trust because I'm the opposing side, but I want to at least gain her trust that I understand, sort of her loss. So from my perspective, I want to put that on the table that, when we go through the negotiations, the remainder of the day, we're not negotiating in any way or suggesting in any way that this is not, a tragic loss, or that her relationship is any way diminished in value for some reason, or that his legacy as a husband and as a father, we don't value. I want to make sure that that's clearly understood, that that's not an issue for us. We recognize that it's a tremendous loss by all information and accounts. He was a good man and a good father. So that's not, when we negotiate and we make our offers, it's not based on the value of that relationship. Instead, what we're doing is we're negotiating on the value of a lawsuit. right? In a lawsuit that we feel the doctor was, acted appropriately, but there are issues and there's risks, and we never know exactly what a jury was going to do. And so there are certain things we have to take into consideration, and that's why we're here. And furthermore, when we went through the presentations, the plaintiff's attorney, the patient's attorney, had raised a number of things about what he felt were inaccuracies in the medical records and the documentation, and tried to suggest that the doctor had put something in the records that before his death, based on what he had said, could be refuted. So we had looked into that. We had evaluated everything. And one of the things that I wanted to do in an assertive way, not an aggressive way, is, again, start off by saying we have disagreements on how we're approaching the assessment of this case. And what we don't have disagreement, but there are some things we don't disagree on. And again, one of the things we don't disagree on is, the value of the loss, the relationship between her and her husband, the dedicated father that he was. That's not in dispute. But what is in dispute, and one thing we will not consider as a factor in the case, is whether or not there's any implication that there's falsified records or things of that nature, because clearly, based upon my interactions with my client, based upon looking at everything and understanding how not everything in a medical record can get documented, we're just not, based on the evidence, we're just not going to value or create value in the case and in the negotiation for that argument. Now, if we have to go through discovery, if we have to go through litigation for 2 years and I'm proven wrong on that, then obviously we'll reconsider. But I didn't think I was wrong, and I still don't think I'm wrong on that aspect. And I needed them to know by asserting that we will not create value in the negotiation for that argument. And so then I have to concede certain things in the case, or else I would look disingenuous and inauthentic. If I come in and very aggressively, this is a case that's defensible, we don't have any weaknesses, there are no risks, the question that anybody would rightfully have a right to ask is, then why are you here? So you want to recognize from the perspective of the other side that they're going to be asking questions about, well, why are you here if it's such a great case to defend? And so you concede that, you take that off the table right off the get-go as to why it is that we're here, what I'm willing to put value in, and what we're willing to negotiate the case over. And then that starts to lay out, right, the true definition of the negotiation. And the plaintiff's attorney was from Boston, and very much used to adversarial negotiations, and came in sort of armed in that way, and then said afterwards, when the case resolved, and in fact recently sent me a letter, said that he was grateful to have sort of that open dialogue, that it didn't have to be adversarial. And so even though, and I think we looked at a slide earlier, and when you look at the Galinsky article, they use the word opponent in their discussion. And I think, when we look at opponent, or we consider the opposing side, or we consider, strategic negotiations, the persons, particularly in my world involving litigation, we often use that opponent, or it's an opposing viewpoint or an opposing side, or litigants. It really is sort of not, the terminology isn't conducive to anything but sort of a fight during a negotiation. And what I'm suggesting is you don't have to. You can have opposing viewpoints, but it doesn't have to be a negotiation where it's so competitive that it's more, a war or a fight. And it can be a discussion, and you can have opposing views, but it doesn't have to have that sort of flavor of antagonism to it. Now, of course, depending upon who you're negotiating with, that doesn't mean they're going to agree with you, and so they may very well be antagonistic, but you don't have to treat it that way. And that's true whether you're negotiating with a spouse, and hopefully it wouldn't be an antagonistic negotiation, or negotiating with a coworker or somebody who you're supervising, or a boss, or you're going into an owner or a supervisor, asking for a wage increase, or you're in a litigation like mine, or, selling or buying a car. It doesn't have to be, an antagonistic negotiation. You don't have to make it such, even though it's a strategic negotiation with opposing views. So, again, the goal of perspective taking and empathy is to achieve positive effects created by appreciating other people's interests without forfeiting our own claims, concerns, and positions. And again, I think the thing, as you guys are developing this skill or feel comfortable using empathy and or perspective taking, the one thing you have to always be mindful of, and sometimes it's not because you don't have the capacity to rein in empathy before it becomes sympathy. Sometimes you don't have the capacity to be assertive, and that's one of the things you kind of have to struggle with as you walk through, when you become empathetic and then you don't, and you necessarily can, and let's try that again. When you become empathetic and then find yourself not getting the outcome that you want, is it because, again, you're giving into sympathy and you're giving too much concession, or is it you really just don't have the capacity to assert for the outcome you want, and therefore you feel like you need to get a deal done, and so you don't get the deal that you want? Or it could be a bit of a combination of both. And so I think when you look at the materials, you really need to think about whether or not it's, when you don't get a negotiated outcome to your benefit that's better than your BATNA, is that because, you used empathy and you became too empathetic / sympathetic and conceded too much? Or is it that you used the right amount, but you just didn't assert well enough to get the deal that you wanted? And when you're doing perspective seeking questions, so again, if you've needed to use empathy to try to gain trust, and now it's simply perspective seeking, or you're not using empathy at all and it's just perspective taking, some of the questions that you want to kind of ask in a broad manner, and then really, try to ask as many questions in the various subcategories. So what is the person's interests, motivations, and needs, right? And that's going to help you develop a BATNA too, right? So if you're setting a negotiated, outcome for you, and you don't have the ability to, it's really not, to understand what their interests are, what their needs are, you may have just an outcome that's not based in reality, that you've misinterpreted your BATNA, and that you really can't get a better deal than's being offered. So again, perspective taking helps you develop, what you should get out of, or what you think you want, and then it also helps you influence some someone by trying to get them to change their perspective. And in order to do that, you need to know, again, you need to know what is the person's interests, motivations, and needs. You need to know what are the alternatives available to the other person. Whoa, where did that go? You need to know what are the alternatives available to the other person that can avail themselves of in order to get their needs met. In other words, what's their BATNA? And why is the person acting this way? And, C, in fairness, potentially implicates both perspective taking, but if you determine that the reason they're acting this way is because there is some emotional component to this, then that may indeed, call in the need to do or be empathetic when you're trying to influence someone. So again, and I really want you all to focus in as we continue to walk through the materials getting into assertiveness, is that you really, try to think of the materials and the things that you're reading and hearing and try to put them in different context of which you might be involved. Don't just always put it, well, this is my job and, this is how I'm involved in a negotiation and therefore I always see it this way. And so, if you're mostly negotiating with people you can collaborate with, then some of this stuff may not be as important, but then try to figure out, well, when would I be trying to negotiate with somebody who disagrees with my desired outcome, has their own desired outcome, and it's, opposing views, if you will. What situations is that, whether it's in a business context, whether it's in an employment context, whether it's in a family situation, dealing with, somebody or negotiating with, with a third party on behalf of a family member. Any of those contexts, try these things out in different contexts and see how you would use the concepts in order to try to influence the other side. And do the same thing now that we're getting into assertiveness. Don't just think, well, hey, I can be assertive with my spouse or I can be assertive with my child. Most of us can be, perhaps not most of us, sometimes when you look at some parents, but many of us can be assertive with our own children, right? It becomes easier because of that relationship. But try out assertiveness. And how are you in assertiveness when you're in a restaurant and somebody is there ahead of you and they arrive behind you and they start to move towards a table? Are you assertive in those kind of situations? What types of situations do you feel like, oh, if I could only speak up for myself? Those are the kinds of ones you want to explore. Also being mindful, though, so that you can create some confidence and say, well, I can be assertive in these situations. And then try to understand why that might be, and then try to bridge that gap so you can be assertive in more and more situations. And that's similarly true with being empathetic without it developing into sympathy. When should you take perspective, but when do you need to take perspective and say, okay, I get your perspective, but my needs are this. I need to influence that. So again, this is the concept of leadership and negotiation, and it's always very, very fluid, both during the negotiation, during the conflict, and then when you move from conflict to conflict to conflict, it's going to require different ingredients and different amount of ingredients. So keep up the good work, and we'll see you at the next lecture. Or I'll see you. You'll see me, I won't see you, I guess, right? Have a good night.